Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I want to talk about legal changes in Germany that are underway at breakneck speed at the moment. On Wednesday, November the 18th, this week, our federal parliament, the Bundestag, is holding the third reading of the third law for the protection of the population from an epidemic situation of a national dimension. Or in short, the third population protection law, which is basically an enabling act of our federal government. The first version of this law was passed in March this year, and now they are debating about the third installment. It is heavily criticized from constitutional law scholars and politicians. In today's video, I want to tell you what the process is, where it is at the moment, and most importantly, I want to make the distinction between what Angela Merkel and Jens Spahn, which is our government basically, what they wanted to have in this law and what will probably end up in this law. The Bundesrat, that is the representatives of our federal states, they also need to agree to that, so it could take effect from the beginning of December. And surprise, surprise, beginning of December is exactly when our current lockdown light was supposed to end, which it of course will not. It will go on all the way until next year. So the first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not a lawyer. I was doing my best to research these topics, and I have to say that our media, it seems like, has no intention to make it clear to the public what is really in this law. At several times there were several versions of it that were only in part being disclosed or being discussed in public. It seems like they want to confuse the population deliberately, and especially when these changes to this law are supposed to be carried out in such a record time, within 1 month basically, it gets even more confusing. So I hope I didn't get anything wrong here, but this is my best effort basically. Then the next very important thing is that this law that was passed in its first version in March has an expiration date, and that is by April next year, 2021, it is no longer valid. That is generally a good thing, so this law has an expiration date. However, this is also something that they of course want to change now. And the important questions I want to focus on today is who decides when there is such a nation-threatening crisis and what will happen then. I don't want to go over all the individual measures. I did that in many videos in the past where I told you explicitly what they're trying to do in Germany. I think it is very dystopian, it is very bad. I just want to briefly mention that these measures of course include many violations of fundamental rights and freedoms that we have in this country normally. The government can order you to close your business, they can lock you up at home, they can take your children away, they can do all these crazy things. Religious service will no longer be possible, political demonstrations, etc., etc. It is basically martial law. But I really want to focus on these questions, like who has the power to turn this switch? Because this law speaks, of course, of a threat to the nation or to the population, as they say these days, that is an epidemic of nationwide proportions, and that is in its essence, I would say, temporary. So you can imagine this really like an on and an off switch for the restrictions of our rights. They can turn off the constitution temporarily if they decide that now we have a crisis. That is at least how I understood this. And in March, our federal parliament, the Bundestag, has decided by single majority vote, I think it was, that yes, now we have an epidemic, now we have a crisis, so go ahead. Do your thing, enact all these measures and all these restrictions and all these new regulations in order to fight this disease. And then until further notice, or until the parliament by a similar vote would decide that now it's over, all these measures stay legal, even though under normal conditions they would be absolutely illegal, of course. So it is really interesting to see that Jens Spahn and Angela Merkel, they wanted this power to go to the ministry, to the Federal Ministry for Health, so to Jens Spahn's ministry. It was not their intention to have the parliament vote on that. So the question, is there a crisis now, yes or no? They wanted a federal ministry to make that decision. So basically Jens Spahn by himself could have declared the state of a pandemic and then basically switched off our constitution. Until the middle of October, that was still in the version of the law. It was taken out again later. But this is what they originally wanted. But the current version I think that we have right now, and who knows if this is gonna be the final version, I doubt it. It will probably change 10 or 20 times until it is actually made a law in the beginning of December. But in the current version, it is still the parliament that has to vote on that. But then all the measures will be taken by the federal government, and there is no monitoring, there is no reporting, and there is no evaluation from the side of the parliament. The parliament just turns the switch, and from that time on, it's very important to understand that the government can do whatever they want within the framework of that law, which is pretty broad, as I said before. So the parliament turns off the constitution by a single vote, and then the government can do whatever they want. And the funny thing is, the law doesn't even say what happens when the parliament votes this switch in the other direction again, when they try to switch it off. And this is not my impression, this is what the Wissenschaftlicher Dienst, that is the scientific service, or I would rather say scholarly service, of the German Bundestag has put in their evaluation. So these are very, very smart people. These are actual law scholars who wrote this, and their function is to serve as consultants in these technical questions to our parliament. It is called Wissenschaftlicher Dienst des Deutschen Bundestages. But the criticism becomes even harsher. There is a scholar of law called Hans Michael Heinig, and he warned that our state, the German state, could become a fascistoid, hysterical hygiene state. Other people then used the similar term hygiene-dictatorship. So I am really curious about what will happen this Wednesday, who will vote in favor of it, who will vote against it, what the Liberal Party will say, what the Communist Party will say, what the AfD will say in their statements. And of course, most important, what will be in the draft that will go to the Bundesrat then, to the lower house. Even though I really dislike these not always perfect historical comparisons, in this case it is really striking because the name is so similar. I told you in the beginning that I see that, and many other people see it the same way. This new law is an enabling act, and as you all know probably, we had an enabling act a couple of decades earlier already in Germany. And now listen how this law was called. I repeat once again, this current law is called a law for the protection of the population in case of an epidemic situation of a nationwide proportion or dimension, or in short, Population Protection Act. And in February of 1933, they called that thing the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State. Verordnung des Reichspräsidenten zum Schutz von Volk und Staat. The name got a little longer and they tried a little bit harder to hide what they actually want to do, but I think seen from a certain perspective, it's pretty much the same thing, or at least very similar in nature. So that was my brief report from Germany. Of course, I will follow up on that after Wednesday when we will know a little more about how it went in the Bundestag. And as always, let me know how it is in your country. I'm not only interested in the measures. Is there a push to somehow change the constitution or make a law that goes around the constitution or switches off the constitution temporarily like here in Germany? Or are there any critics that say this is unconstitutional what you're doing, and how is the government responding? Is there even a public discussion, or is there some discussion or mention in the media about constitutional concerns about these measures that we see in almost all countries now? So maybe it is a dry topic that was presented also in a very dry way, but nevertheless, if you enjoyed it, if you think this information is important, because please don't forget, even though I think it shouldn't be, Germany is unfortunately still somewhat of a role model for other countries. So if Germany does this now, some other countries might point at Germany and say, look, the Germans did that, so it's okay, or we should think about a similar thing. It will have something of a trigger function for other countries. Not as strong as if the Americans do something like that, but still, Germany has some kind of an influence still on many other countries, especially in the European Union. So this is also a part of the Great German Experiment, and it will be used. The data that will be gathered here and the facts that will be established here will be used in other countries as well, make no mistake about that. So stay healthy this winter, but most important, stay vigilant this winter. Servus, Kameraden.